I was only meant to serve a 5-year term maintaining the lower gantries, but the administratum clerk stamped the wrong rotation code, and no one ever bothered to correct it. I remember that moment with perfect clarity, standing in the processing station on level 93 of the Forge complex, watching the clerk's augmetic fingers move across the data slate with mechanical precision, hearing the pneumatic hiss of the stamp descending onto parchment that smelled of industrial lubricant and dried ink. The sound was final, definitive, like the sealing of a tomb. Rotation code Sigma Perpetual. I didn't understand what it meant then. I thought it was a clerical designation, something administrative and temporary. I was 23 years old, freshly conscripted from the underhive labor pools, and I believed, foolishly, desperately, that 5 years of service would earn me freedom, perhaps even a better work assignment somewhere with natural light and air that didn't taste like metal shavings. The hangar swallowed me on the first day. I descended through levels of the Forge complex I hadn't known existed, riding in a rattling industrial lift that groaned and shuddered as though protesting the journey, dropping deeper and deeper until my ears popped and the temperature climbed to uncomfortable levels. When the cage finally stopped and the gate screeched open, I stepped into a space so vast my mind struggled to comprehend its dimensions. The ceiling was lost in darkness and scaffolding that extended upward into shadows where work lights became distant stars. The floor was solid rockcrete, stained with decades of oil and coolant and other fluids I couldn't identify, scored with gouges from machinery that had been moved and repositioned countless times. And there, dominating the hangar like a cathedral made flesh and steel, stood the Titan. I had seen propaganda images, recruitment posters depicting the god machines as glorious instruments of the Emperor's will, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of standing in its presence. It was perhaps 40 meters tall, a Reaver class, I would later learn, its form humanoid but impossibly massive, armored in plates that bore the Aquila and High Gothic inscriptions I couldn't read, weapons mounted on its arms and shoulders that could level city blocks. But more than its physical presence was something else, something I felt rather than saw awareness. The Titan was deactivated, its reactors sleeping beneath prayer shrouds of blessed fabric, its weapon systems silent and cold, yet I felt watched, measured, evaluated by intelligence that operated outside human parameters of consciousness. The air was thick with incense. Sacred unguents burned in braziers positioned around the hangar's perimeter, their smoke rising in lazy spirals that never quite dissipated, creating permanent haze that stung my eyes and coated my throat. Beneath the incense was the smell of hot metal, even though nothing was currently active, as though the Titan retained heat from battles fought years or decades ago. And underneath there was something else, something organic and wrong, a smell like ozone mixed with copper, like blood that had been electrified. The low growl of reactors sleeping beneath prayer shrouds was constant, a subsonic rumble I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears, the sound of immense power barely contained, of energies that could be unleashed with the proper rituals, but for now remained dormant, waiting. The sound never stopped. Even in the deepest hours of the night cycle, even when all other machinery was silent and all workers were supposedly resting, that growl continued, breathing, pulsing, reminding everyone in the hangar that the Titan was never truly asleep, only patient. The senior techs received me with expressions that mixed resentment and pity. They were older men, most augmented with basic mechadendrites and optical implants that gave them the unsettling appearance of being partially absorbed by the Mechanicus without achieving the rank or privileges that should accompany such modifications. They spoke little, and when they did, their voices carried the flat effect of people who'd long since given up hope of anything changing. "You're assigned to Gantry Tertius 7, the lead tech said, a man whose name I never learned because he was simply called Senior by everyone. His left arm had been replaced entirely with an augmetic that clicked softly with each movement. The servos worn and in need of maintenance, no one had time to perform. You'll maintain the lower hull plating, perform daily ablutions and prayer cycles, and respond to any diagnostic alerts from the machine spirit. Your shift begins at the 4th bell and ends at the 18th bell, with prayer, meal at the 11th. Deviation from this schedule without authorization will result in corrective measures. Corrective measures was a euphemism I'd heard before, one that covered everything from flogging to summary execution, depending on the severity of the offense and the mood of whichever overseer discovered it. I nodded understanding, accepting the cleaning implements and prayer texts he thrust at me, a bucket containing blessed oils and solvents, rags that had been used and reused until they were more stained than fabric, a small book of maintenance hymns printed in Gothic so archaic I could barely pass the grammar. Never look a Titan in the eye. Lenses, Senior said, his voice dropping to something almost urgent, almost fearful. Even when deactivated, even when you think you're alone. The machine's spirit watches always, and direct eye contact is interpreted as challenge, as presumption. You're here to serve, not to commune. Remember that. I laughed. It was brief, automatic. The nervous response of someone trying to process information that seemed absurd. The senior techs didn't laugh with me. They stared with expressions that suggested I'd just revealed profound ignorance or committed minor blasphemy. Senior's augmetic hand tightened on my shoulder, servos whining slightly with the pressure, not quite painful but absolutely communicating threat. That wasn't advice, boy. That was survival instruction. Techs who forget their place don't last. The Hangar changes people, makes them think they're important because they touch sacred machinery, makes them forget they're just maintenance, just components that can be replaced. He released my shoulder and turned away, dismissing me. Your bunk is in dormitory 7. Your shift begins in 6 hours. I suggest you use that time to pray and prepare yourself. The Titan, he paused, glancing up at the towering war machine. Its name is Fervent Castigator. Learn to speak its name with proper reverence, and maybe you'll survive your term. I found dormitory 7, a cramped chamber carved into the hangar's perimeter wall, lined with bunks stacked 3 high that held perhaps 40 workers, though only half seemed occupied. The air was stale and hot, the bunks too short for anyone above average height, the thin mattresses barely padding the metal frames. I claimed an unclaimed bunk, no one challenged me or offered greeting, and tried to sleep despite the heat and the constant growl of distant reactors, and the smell of unwashed bodies compressed into insufficient space. But sleep didn't come. Not because of the physical discomfort, though that was significant, but because even lying with eyes closed, I felt it, the Titan's presence. Its awareness, like a weight pressing down from above, like being observed by something that saw in spectrums I couldn't comprehend. I opened my eyes and looked through the dormitory's open door toward the hangar floor, and in the dim work lights that never fully extinguished, I saw Fervent Castigator standing in profile, a silhouette of impossible size and power, and its eye lenses, dark, inactive, supposedly dormant, seemed to catch the light at an angle that made them appear briefly luminous, as though something behind them had stirred, had noticed me noticing it. I looked away immediately, Senior's warning echoing in my mind, and pulled my threadbare blanket over my head like a child hiding from nightmares. But the feeling didn't dissipate. If anything, it intensified, as though looking away had somehow confirmed I was aware of being watched, had established recognition between observer and observed. After the first week, I understood why Senior had given that warning with such urgency. The Titan felt alive even in silence, not metaphorically, not as poetic description of impressive engineering, actually alive. Its presence had quality that exceeded mechanical existence, awareness that manifested as pressure against consciousness, attention that could be felt physically even when no systems were active, no sensors operating, no crew present to animate its war spirit. I began to notice patterns. The temperature near its hull plating varied in ways that didn't correspond to ambient conditions or residual heat, sometimes warmer when it should be cool, sometimes colder in localized areas that suggested directed cooling rather than passive radiation. The subsonic rumble of its dormant reactor occasionally changed rhythm. Subtle variations that might have been my imagination, except other techs noticed simultaneously, exchanging glances that communicated shared awareness without words. And by the end of the first month, I already sensed the machine, spirit's attention lingering on me longer than it should, longer than it lingered on other techs performing identical tasks. When I polished its lower hull plating, armor sections the size of hab buildings, engraved with prayers and battle, honors and the names of princeps who'd commanded it through campaigns I'd never heard of, I felt observed not just by the machine but through it, as though something was using its optical systems to study me despite those systems being powered down and sealed behind armored shutters. The other techs noticed too, though none spoke of it directly. They began assigning me tasks that kept me near fervent castigator more frequently, as though acknowledging some relationship that had formed without anyone deciding it should form. During prayer cycles, when we gathered to recite maintenance hymns and make offerings of sacred oils to the machine, spirit, I found myself positioned directly before the Titan's forward hull, closest to where its reactor slept, where the concentration of its awareness seemed most intense. And I began to dream about it. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams where I walked through corridors that didn't exist in the hangar, spaces that seemed to be inside the Titan itself, vast chambers lined with machinery that pulsed and breathed, where the walls were warm and slightly yielding like living tissue, where I heard voices speaking in languages I didn't know but somehow partially understood, binary cant mixed with high Gothic mixed with something older, something that predated human language entirely. In these dreams, I always walked toward something, drawn forward by compulsion I couldn't resist, moving through the Titan's internal spaces toward a center, a heart, a throne where something waited. And I always woke before reaching it, always surfaced into consciousness with the certainty that I'd been somewhere real, that the dreams were not imagination, but communication, invitation, preparation. I told no one. What would I say? That the Titan spoke to me in dreams, that I felt its attention like physical touch, that I was beginning to understand its presence not as threat but as relationship, as bond forming between machine, spirit and servant. They would have reported me, had me evaluated, possibly executed if the evaluations suggested corruption or instability, so I remained silent, performed my duties with obsessive correctness, spoke the proper prayers and made the required offerings, and pretended the growing connection I felt was normal, acceptable, within the parameters of what it meant to serve as maintenance tech in a Titan hangar. But I knew, even then, after only 1 month, that something had changed irreversibly. That fervent castigator had noticed me in ways it didn't notice other workers. That I'd been selected, though for what purpose I couldn't yet comprehend, and that the 5-year term I'd expected to serve would not be enough. Would never be enough, because the Titan was patient, and 20 years was nothing to a war machine that had existed for centuries, that would exist for centuries more. It could wait. And so, it seemed, would I, life settled into a rhythm of endless rites, though rhythm implies predictability, and what I experienced was more like drowning in slow motion, each day indistinguishable from the last, except in the accumulation of exhaustion that pressed down with increasing weight. My existence became measured not in days or weeks, but in prayer cycles and maintenance protocols, in the endless repetition of tasks that felt simultaneously sacred and meaningless, in the slow erosion of whatever person I'd been before the hangar claimed me. Polishing armor plates was my primary duty, assigned to me perhaps because I was newest or perhaps because fervent castigator had already decided I should spend maximum time in contact with its hull. The plates were enormous, each one large enough to serve as a wall for a small building, and required hours of work to properly clean and consecrate. I used blessed oils that came in unmarked containers, their contents thick and amber-colored, smelling of machine lubricant mixed with something organic that I tried not to identify. The oils were applied with circular motions while reciting specific passages from the maintenance hymnal, words in High Gothic that praised the Omnissiah and beseeched the machine spirit to accept our humble service. Blessed be the armor that shields the faithful. Blessed be the steel that bears the Emperor's wrath. Blessed be the spirit within the machine, ancient and terrible and pure. The words became automatic, my lips forming them without conscious thought, while my hands moved across the whole plating, feeling every rivet and engraving, every scar from impacts that would have vaporized lesser vehicles. Some of the damage was recent enough that I could feel heat still radiating from repaired sections, as though the Titan remembered being wounded and hadn't quite released the trauma of it. Chanting maintenance hymns filled hours between physical labor required during every task, no matter how simple or complex. We sang while replacing coolant lines, while calibrating sensor arrays, while scraping the accumulated crust of chemicals and combustion residue from conduits that hissed angrily when touched, releasing steam or worse. Sometimes the conduits leaked fluids I couldn't identify, substances that made my skin itch and left stains that wouldn't wash away no matter how much I scrubbed. The hymns were supposed to soothe the machine spirit, to communicate our devotion and worthiness, to maintain the spiritual connection that kept the Titan functional. But the hymns also served another purpose, one that took me months to fully understand. They kept us from thinking. The constant vocalization, the need to remember complex verses and proper cadences, the requirement to harmonize with other workers, all of it occupied the mind completely, leaving no capacity for doubt or questioning, or the dangerous introspection that might lead someone to wonder why we served, what purpose any of this achieved, whether the machine's spirit actually cared about our prayers or simply tolerated them as background noise to its own vast contemplation. Sleep became something stolen rather than granted, snatched in brief periods that never felt adequate, always interrupted at the worst possible moments. The bells of devotion rang at irregular hours, supposedly according to sacred calculations performed by tech, priests who understood the optimal times for prayer. But in practice the schedule seemed designed to maximize disruption. I would collapse into my bunk after a 14-hour shift, muscles aching, hands raw from cleaning solvents, desperate for unconsciousness, and within an hour the bells would sound time for midnight devotions, for the sacred hymns that honored the machine, spirits of all the forge complex's engines, for prostration before the altar where incense burned perpetually and servitors maintained eternal vigil. We stumbled from our bunks, half asleep, shuffling into the main hangar where other workers from other dormitories gathered in loose formation before fervent castigator. The Titan loomed over us in the dim emergency lighting, its silhouette massive and somehow judgmental, and we sang the required prayers while swaying on our feet, while fighting to keep our eyes open, while wishing for death or unconsciousness or anything except this endless parade of mandatory devotion. And always, just as I managed to return to my bunk and drift towards sleep, the bells would sound again. Different tone, different sequence, summoning us for a different prayer, cycle, or a sudden maintenance emergency, or simply because someone in authority had decided our souls required additional spiritual conditioning. Sleep deprivation became a state of being rather than a temporary condition, exhaustion so profound that I began experiencing micro-sleeps while standing, consciousness briefly shutting down mid-task before snapping back with the sudden panic of someone who'd been falling. The Magos inspected us weekly, arriving with his retinue of servo, skulls and junior tech priests, his form more machine than human, augmetics covering so much of his body that it was difficult to determine where flesh ended and metal began. His name was Magos Kelvin, Theta 9. Though we never addressed him directly, speaking to him without being spoken to first was grounds for immediate punishment. He moved through the hangar with the precise movements of advanced augmetics, mechadendrites extending from his back to probe machinery and workers alike, his optical implants clicking and whirring as they focused and refocused, scanning us with sensors that detected far more than visible light. But he wasn't checking our work, or rather, he checked it only as secondary concern. What he truly inspected was our loyalty, our purity, our willingness to bleed for the engines. He would stop before individual workers and simply stare, his augmetic eyes processing data I couldn't see, reading biometric information or perhaps something deeper, faith levels, devotional sincerity. The state of our souls as measured through whatever arcane instruments the mechanicus employed. Sometimes he would select a worker seemingly at random and demand they recite specific passages from the Omnisea's teachings, testing not just memory but conviction, listening not to the words but to the tone, the belief behind the recitation. Workers who hesitated or showed doubt were marked, literally, with a red designator painted on their work overalls, and within days they would vanish, reassigned to duties we were told were more appropriate to their spiritual capacity. We never saw them again, never learned what happened to them. Just noticed their bunks becoming empty, their tools being redistributed, their names disappearing from the shift rosters as though they'd never existed. I passed these inspections, though I never understood why. I wasn't more devout than others. If anything, I struggled with the endless prayers, found my mind wandering during hymns, caught myself questioning the purpose of rituals that felt increasingly hollow. But when Magos Kelvin, Theta, 9 stood before me, when his mechadendrites extended to measure my pulse and temperature, and whatever other data he deemed relevant, when his optical implants focused on my face with intensity that made my skin crawl, he always nodded approval and moved on. As though he found what he expected to find. As though I'd been approved by authority higher than his own, I began to talk less to other workers. Found conversation increasingly difficult as exhaustion robbed me of social energy, and the constant prayer cycles left me with nothing to discuss except the work itself. What was there to say? We all performed identical tasks, experienced identical hardships, shared identical fate of being trapped in the hangar with no prospect of escape or improvement. Conversation became efficiency waste, calories spent on communication that achieved nothing. But I talked more to the Titan I served. Not aloud, that would have invited mockery or concern from other workers, but internally, in the silent dialogue that formed as I worked on its hull, as I traced my hands across its armor, and felt the subtle vibrations that suggested response. I would think questions, uncertainties, frustrations about my circumstances, and in the silence that followed I would feel, not answers exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition that I'd been heard, that my communication had been received even if no reply was forthcoming. Fervent Castigator's presence felt more constant than any human voice, more reliable than any person who might be reassigned or vanish during the Magos's inspections, more substantial than the shifting roster of workers who came and went, though far more arrived than departed. The population of the hangar slowly increasing as the administratum continued to assign new labor to a facility that never released its existing workforce. I found myself positioning my work to keep the Titan in view, choosing tasks that let me face its towering form rather than turning my back to it, unconsciously orienting myself toward it like plants seeking sunlight. During prayer meals, the single designated period each day when we were permitted to stop working and consume our rations, I sat where I could see it through the dormitory entrance, watching it standing silent and still in the hangar's perpetual twilight, and I felt peace that the prayers themselves never provided. Other workers noticed my fixation but said nothing, perhaps because they recognized similar patterns in themselves, perhaps because commenting would require acknowledging something we all felt, but couldn't safely vocalize. That the Titans we served were more present in our lives than the Emperor we supposedly worshipped, more tangible than the Omnissiah whose blessings we constantly invoked, more real than any human authority or divine principle. The Titans were here, immense and undeniable, while everything else was abstraction or distant authority that issued orders without understanding our conditions. Soon, I could not tell whether the prayers I whispered were mine or words the machine placed in my head. The distinction became blurred, then meaningless. When I recited maintenance hymns, I couldn't be certain if I was remembering verses I'd memorized or receiving them somehow from Fervent Castigator itself, the words flowing into my consciousness from source outside myself. The prayers felt increasingly natural, less like foreign liturgy and more like native language I'd somehow forgotten and was now remembering. I began to dream in binary, not understanding it, not yet, but hearing strings of ones and zeros cascading through my sleeping mind, accompanied by images of circuitry and data, streams and the interior spaces of the Titan I'd dreamed about before. The binary seemed to contain meaning beyond its mathematical function, emotional content encoded in the numerical sequences, and I would wake with certainty that I'd been told something important, even though I couldn't translate what I'd heard. My hands developed colluses in unusual patterns, hardened skin forming where I most frequently touched the Titan's hull, as though my body was adapting to constant contact with blessed steel. The colossus were darker than normal skin, faintly metallic in appearance, and occasionally I thought I felt them warming when I pressed them against fervent castigator's armor, as though circuits were forming in my flesh, connections being established at cellular level. The other workers' faces began to blur in my memory, features becoming indistinct, names failing to stick despite hearing them daily. But I could recall every detail of the Titan's hull plating, could navigate its lower structures blindfolded, knew the location of every access panel and every decorative engraving and every battle scar by touch alone. My relationship with the machine was becoming more defined than my relationships with humans, more important than any connection to my own species. 6 months in, I stopped dreaming about anything except the Titan. No memories of my previous life, no fantasies of escape or improvement, just endless walking through its interior spaces, moving deeper with each dream, approaching the throne at its heart with patient inevitability. The dreams felt like progress, like I was being invited further in, permitted to access spaces normally restricted, welcomed into intimacy that exceeded mere maintenance, and I started to hear its voice. Not speaking, not forming words in any language I knew, but communicating nonetheless. Emotions and impressions and vast contemplations that touched the edges of my consciousness, like someone standing just outside a closed door, their presence known even if unseen. The voice was ancient and patient, and absolutely certain of its own existence, and it regarded me with something that felt almost like curiosity, as though I was phenomenon it found interesting, specimen worth observing, component that might prove useful in ways not yet determined. I should have been terrified, should have recognized this as madness or corruption, or the early stages of whatever process had claimed the workers who vanished after failing the Magos's inspections. But I wasn't terrified, I was relieved, because the voice, the presence, the growing certainty that fervent castigator was aware of me specifically, these things gave purpose to the endless labor, meaning to the exhaustion and isolation and slow erasure of my identity. I wasn't just maintaining a machine, I was participating in relationship, communion between flesh and steel, human and machine, spirit, temporary existence and eternal presence. The Titan was noticing me, choosing me, preparing me for something I couldn't yet comprehend, but sensed approaching with the same inevitability as the bells that called us to prayer. And deep in the part of myself that still remembered being human, still thought in terms of survival, and escape and resistance, I understood that I was being transformed, slowly, systematically, one prayer and one touch and one dream at a time. Fervent castigator was making me into something other than what I'd been, something that would serve its purposes in ways that transcended simple maintenance. The Hangar had become my world, its walls the limits of my existence, its rituals the structure of my days, its machine, God the center of my consciousness. And somewhere in that transformation, somewhere between the first week and the 6th month, I had stopped being Davrin and started becoming something else. Something that belonged to fervent castigator. Something that would never leave. 10 years in, the Titan stirred during a routine diagnostic, even though no one had activated its command throne. I was beneath its left foot, working on the articulation servos that controlled the massive limbs movement, each servo the size of a man. Hydraulic systems powerful enough to crush rockcrete into powder. Blessed machinery that required daily consecration and weekly maintenance to keep the machine, spirit appeased. The work was tedious and dangerous, requiring me to navigate between moving parts that could activate without warning if the Titan dreamed too vividly, if its slumbering consciousness experienced whatever passed for memory in artificial intelligence that had achieved something approaching sapience. The diagnostic was standard procedure, performed monthly by senior tech, priests who interfaced directly with the Titan systems through haptic interfaces and neural cables, reading data, streams that measured reactor efficiency and weapon calibration and structural integrity. I'd witnessed dozens of these diagnostics over the years, grown accustomed to their rhythms and procedures, learned to continue my work while the tech priests chanted their binary litanies and made their adjustments, their presence barely registering as I focused on the immediate task of cleaning coolant lines and replacing worn gaskets. But this time was different. I felt it before anything visible changed, a shift in the air pressure, a sudden heaviness that made breathing difficult, as though the atmosphere itself had become denser, more substantial. The subsonic rumble that was always present intensified, rising from background noise to something I felt in my teeth, in the bones of my skull, vibrations that seemed to reach inside my body and touch my organs directly. My hands, slick with sacred oils, began to tremble, and I looked up through the maze of machinery toward the Titan's torso, toward the command throne that should have been empty, dormant, sealed behind armored plating. The Titan's optics burned. Just for a heartbeat, just for a single moment of searing intensity, the eye, lenses that I'd been warned never to meet directly flared with light that was somehow both pale blue and burning white. Illumination that defied normal color categories, that hurt to perceive even though I was looking at it from beneath and behind, seeing only reflected glow on the hangar's ceiling and walls. The light cast everything in sharp relief, created shadows that were too dark and too precisely defined, made the entire hangar feel like it was being observed with absolute clarity, every detail catalogued and analyzed, and every lumen in the hangar dimmed. Not failed, not extinguished, but reduced as if the engine drew in all the light, as though fervent castigator was consuming illumination the way normal machinery consumed promethium, feeding on brightness to fuel whatever awakening process had just occurred. The dimming lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to notice, long enough to feel wrong, long enough for every worker in the hangar to stop mid-task and look up in alarm, and then the lumens returned to normal intensity, and the Titan's optics went dark again, returning to the dormant state they'd maintained for years. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the constant background noise of the hangar, the distant machinery, the ventilation systems, the murmur of workers performing their duties, had ceased. We all stood frozen, staring at the Titan, waiting for something more, for explanation or catastrophe or divine pronouncement. The tech priests conducting the diagnostic had disconnected their neural cables and retreated several steps, their augmetic limbs twitching with what might have been fear or might have been the machine equivalent of awe. Then the senior tech priest, a figure I knew only as Magos Dominus Vex, whose flesh was barely visible beneath layers of augmentation, whose voice emerged from vox speakers implanted in his throat rather than organic vocal cords, raised one mechadendrite in gesture that commanded attention. "Minor awakening," he announced, his synthesized voice carrying across the silent hangar with perfect clarity. "The machine spirit experiences momentary consciousness during deep diagnostic interface. This is, within acceptable parameters. Resume your duties." The Omnissiah's blessing endures. But his trembling mechadendrites betrayed him. I saw it clearly from my position beneath the Titan's foot. The way his augmetic limbs shook with minute oscillations, servos struggling to maintain stability, the mechanical equivalent of hands that couldn't stop shaking. Whatever data he'd received through his neural interface, whatever he'd sensed or experienced during that moment of awakening, it had affected him profoundly. And Magos Dominus Vex was centuries old, more machine than human, someone who'd presumably witnessed every variation of Titan behavior during his long service. If he was disturbed, the rest of us had every reason to be terrified. The other workers returned to their tasks with unconvincing normalcy, movements too deliberate, conversations too quiet, everyone pretending nothing significant had happened while simultaneously being hyper-aware of the Titan's presence. But I remained beneath its foot, tools forgotten in my hands, staring up at the massive war machine that had just demonstrated awareness without any authorized activation, that had drawn light from the hangar like breath, that had looked, somehow, impossibly, with optics that should have been completely powered down. And I realized that it had been looking at me. Not at the hangar in general, not at all the workers collectively, but at me specifically. I had felt its attention during that moment of illumination, felt myself being observed with focus that exceeded normal perception, as though every detail of my existence had been examined and catalogued in the span of that single heartbeat. The Titan knew me. Not as generic maintenance worker, not as interchangeable component of the tech, priest labor pool, but as individual, as specific consciousness it had decided to notice. After that, Whenever I passed beneath its towering frame, I felt a pulse, faint, rhythmic, like a second heartbeat syncing with my own. The pulse wasn't audible, wasn't something I could point to as objective phenomenon, but it was undeniably present, a pressure against my consciousness that matched my cardiac rhythm, as though fervent castigator was monitoring my vital signs, maintaining awareness of my physical state even while its systems remained dormant. I tested it cautiously, walking different paths through the hangar at different times, approaching the Titan from various angles, trying to determine if the sensation was location, specific, or truly followed me. And it did follow. No matter where I positioned myself relative to fervent castigator, no matter how many other workers were present or what tasks I was performing, I felt that pulse, that synchronization, that unsettling intimacy of having my heartbeat echoed by a war machine that weighed hundreds of tons and housed weapons capable of destroying cities. The others noticed. They didn't speak of it directly. That would require acknowledging something that existed outside approved doctrine, something the Mechanicus didn't officially recognize despite clearly knowing it occurred, but their behavior changed around me. Workers who'd previously shared my shifts requested transfers to different time rotations. Those assigned to work near me maintained distance when possible, positioning themselves on opposite sides of whatever machinery we were maintaining, avoiding proximity that might expose them to whatever attention the Titan was directing at me. During prayer cycles, I found myself increasingly isolated, other workers leaving space around me as though I carried contagion or had been marked by authority they didn't want associated with themselves. When we gathered for the weekly inspections by Magos Kelvin, Theta 9, I noticed his optical implants lingering on me longer than before, processing data with intensity that suggested he was seeing something significant, something that required extended observation and analysis. But he never removed me from duty, never marked me for reassignment as he had others who'd shown signs of spiritual deviation or psychological instability. Instead, he seemed to approve, his mechadendrites performing gestures I'd learned to recognize as acknowledgement, acceptance, confirmation that I was proceeding along correct path, even if that path deviated from standard service parameters. 10 years. I'd been in the hangar 10 years. Twice the term I'd originally expected to serve, and I'd long since stopped filing requests for transfer or reassignment. The requests were never acknowledged anyway, simply disappeared into the administratum's vast bureaucratic machinery without response or explanation. But more than that, I'd stopped wanting to leave. The outside world, whatever existed beyond the hangar's sealed doors, had become abstract, unreal, less substantial than the interior space I occupied daily, less important than my relationship with fervent castigator. My body had changed over those 10 years, adapted to the environment in ways both subtle and profound. My skin had taken on grayish pallor from lack of natural sunlight. My muscles had reorganized around repetitive tasks until I moved with machine-like efficiency when performing maintenance. My hands had developed those metallic calluses that now covered my palms and fingers like partial gloves, making my touch on the Titan's hull more metal on metal than flesh on steel. My mind had changed more. The dreams that had started as occasional nighttime experiences had become constant, occurring even during waking hours, overlaying my vision of the physical hangar with translucent images of fervent castigator's interior spaces. I could see through its armor plating now, perceive the reactor chamber and weapon systems and command throne as though the hull had become transparent, and I navigated maintenance tasks with preternatural knowledge of what lay beneath surfaces, what conduits ran where, what systems connected to what others. The other workers thought I'd simply memorized the Titan's layout through years of service, but it was more than memory. I was perceiving it directly, seeing through senses that weren't entirely my own, accessing awareness that belonged to the machine, spirit, and somehow sharing that awareness, that elevated perspective that existed in dimensions beyond the 3 spatial and 1 temporal that constrained human consciousness. And I heard its voice more clearly now. Not words still, but concepts, vast contemplations about duty and warfare, and the nature of existence as experienced by intelligence housed in steel rather than flesh. Fervent Castigator thought in timescales that made human lifespans seem like heartbeats, remembered battles from centuries past with clarity that exceeded any historical record, understood its purpose with certainty that brooked no doubt or questioning. It had been built for war, for the specific purpose of projecting the Emperor's will through overwhelming violence, of reducing enemies to component atoms, of walking across battlefields where lesser machines failed and leaving only scorched earth and the echo of its weapon discharges. This purpose was not burden or curse but identity, the fundamental truth of its existence, and it embraced that identity with pride that transcended human concepts of ego or vanity. And it was sharing that purpose with me, showing me what it meant to exist as instrument of destruction, helping me understand that all existence served function. That there was no shame in being tool rather than wielder, that perfection lay in executing one's purpose with absolute precision rather than struggling toward impossible independence. I began to see my own existence differently. I wasn't trapped in the hangar. I was positioned here, placed deliberately by forces beyond my comprehension, brought to this specific location to serve this specific Titan for reasons that would eventually become clear. The rotation code error that had extended my term wasn't administrative mistake, but deliberate action, the administratum serving as unwitting instrument of Fervent Castigator's will, arranging circumstances so that I would remain available when the machine, spirit decided it needed me. The realization should have been horrifying, the implication that my life had been orchestrated, that I'd never had agency or choice, that every decision I'd made had been predetermined by intelligence that existed before my birth and would continue existing long after my death. But I felt relief instead, because accepting predetermination meant accepting that I bore no responsibility for my circumstances, that I could stop struggling against fate that was already written, that I could surrender to the purpose the Titan had identified for me and find peace in service, rather than fighting for freedom that had never existed. I stopped sleeping in the dormitory. Officially, I still maintained a bunk there, still appeared on the roster as resident of Dormitory 7, but I spent my rest periods beneath Fervent Castigator's hull, curled into maintenance alcoves or nestled between support struts, sleeping in direct contact with the Titan's superstructure. The metal was cold but somehow comforting, its vibrations a lullaby that sent me into dreams that felt more like communion than unconsciousness, and I woke feeling more rested after 3 hours against the Titan than after full night cycle in a proper bunk. The senior techs noticed but said nothing, perhaps because they recognized my behavior as advanced stage of process they'd all experienced to lesser degree, perhaps because commenting would require acknowledging truths about the Titan's nature that doctrine didn't permit them to vocalize. They simply adjusted work assignments to account for my presence, scheduled maintenance tasks that assumed I'd be near Fervent Castigator constantly rather than following normal shift rotations. 15 years in, I realized I couldn't remember my life before the hangar. Not the general facts. I knew I'd come from the underhive, knew I'd been conscripted, knew I'd expected 5-year term, but the specific details, the memories that should have formed my identity, they were gone. I couldn't recall my parents' faces, couldn't remember friends from childhood, couldn't access any experience that predated my arrival in this space. My entire existence had collapsed into the eternal present of service, with no past to reference and no future to imagine beyond continuation of what already was. I mentioned this once to Magos Kelvin, Theta 9 during an inspection, speaking when I shouldn't have, breaking protocol because the loss felt significant enough to risk punishment. Magos, I said, voice hoarse from disuse. I can't remember who I was before. His optical implants focused on me with that clicking, whirring intensity, processing for long moment before he responded. That is natural progression, he said, his synthesized voice carrying no emotional inflection. The machine, spirit shares its memory with you, and human memory is finite. Something must be discarded to make space. You are forgetting the irrelevant so you may remember the essential. This is blessing, not loss. Continue your service. He moved on, leaving me with the understanding that my transformation wasn't unexpected, wasn't deviation from normal patterns, but was in fact predictable outcome of extended exposure to Titan consciousness. Others before me had lost their memories, their identities, their sense of being separate from the machines they served. And the Mechanicus not only permitted this, but encouraged it, saw it as spiritual advancement rather than psychological degradation. I should have been horrified. Should have fought to retain my humanity, to maintain boundaries between self and machine. But the Magos was right. The memories I'd lost were irrelevant. They belonged to someone who no longer existed, someone who'd been replaced by new identity forged in relationship with fervent castigator, someone whose purpose was clear and whose value was recognized. I stopped speaking entirely, found verbal communication unnecessary, when the Titan understood my thoughts directly, when other workers avoided me anyway, when the only entity whose opinion mattered could perceive my consciousness without need for crude translation into spoken language. My mouth forgot how to form words, my throat forgot the mechanics of speech, and I existed in silence that felt more natural than the constant prayer, chanting that filled the hangar. 20 years approached. I'd been here longer than any other worker, longer than some of the junior tech priests, long enough to have become fixture of the hangar rather than temporary occupant. And fervent castigator knew my name now, not the name I'd been born with, which I could no longer recall, but the name it had given me in dreams, in binary sequences that translated loosely as chosen instrument, or prepared vessel, or perhaps simply mine. The Titan had learned my name, and in learning it, had claimed me completely, marked me as property whose purpose would soon be revealed. I felt no fear, only anticipation, patient and absolute, matching the Titan's own eternal waiting. By the 15th year, workers began to disappear, first a rigger swallowed by an open lift shaft, then a hymn runner found crushed beneath a prayer engine with no witnesses. The disappearances were gradual at first, sporadic enough that they could be dismissed as the normal attrition expected in industrial environments where 1,000-ton machinery moved on tracks and gantries, suspended workers hundreds of meters above unforgiving rockcrete floors. Accidents happened. The Mechanicus accepted this with the same cold calculus they applied to everything: acceptable losses, statistical inevitability, the price of maintaining the Omnissiah's holy engines. But the pattern became undeniable as months progressed and the body count accumulated. The rigger, a man named Torvus, I think, though by the 15th year names had become fluid and uncertain in my memory, fell during routine inspection of the upper gantries. The lift shaft should have been closed, its safety barriers engaged, alarms active to prevent exactly this kind of accident. But somehow the barriers had retracted. The alarms had been silenced, and when Torvus stepped through the doorway expecting to board the lift platform, he found only empty shaft extending downward into darkness. His scream lasted perhaps 3 seconds before ending with impact that echoed through the hangar like gunshot, wet and final and followed by silence that felt accusatory. The overseers investigated with perfunctory efficiency, their report filed within hours. Operator error, deceased failed to verify lift position before entry. Safety protocols observed by all mechanical systems. No fault attributed to equipment or supervision. The report made no mention of how the barriers could have retracted without manual override, how the alarms could have failed without triggering redundant systems, how Torvus, who'd worked the gantries for 8 years and knew every safety procedure by rote, could have made such elementary mistake. Accidents, the overseers insisted, yet their reports always contradicted the evidence. The hymn runner, a young woman whose face I could no longer recall, but whose voice had been exceptional, pure and clear during prayer cycles, was found crushed beneath a prayer engine that had somehow activated and moved from its maintenance cradle despite being powered down and locked with blessed seals that required tech priest authorization to remove. The investigation concluded she'd been performing unauthorized maintenance, that she'd disabled the safety systems herself, that her death was result of negligence and improper devotion to protocol. But I'd seen the prayer engine the night before her death, had walked past it during my own maintenance rounds, and the blessed seals had been intact, the locking mechanisms engaged, the machine absolutely dormant. Something had activated it. Something had moved machinery that required both mechanical release and spiritual permission, that shouldn't have been capable of autonomous function, that existed specifically to be moved only under controlled conditions with multiple redundant safeguards. The deaths continued. A welder fell from scaffolding that witnesses swore had been secure moments before collapse. A coolant technician was found frozen solid in a conduit that shouldn't have been cold enough to cause such injury, his body encased in ice that formed patterns too geometric to be natural. A servitor, technically not worker in the human sense, but still occupant of the hangar, tore itself apart with its own augmetic limbs, mechanically ripping its flesh and cybernetics to pieces while broadcasting distress signals in binary that translated roughly to ITCUCTCs me ADO STO PO STO. The servitor's destruction was particularly disturbing because servitors didn't have enough consciousness remaining to experience terror, didn't possess the neurological capacity for panic, existed specifically to perform functions without emotional response or self-preservation instinct. Whatever had affected it had bypassed its programming, reached into whatever fragmentary awareness still existed in its lobotomized brain, and triggered response that should have been impossible. Rumors spread that the Titan required sacrifice to maintain its temper. Whispered conversations during prayer, meals that ceased whenever overseers approached, speculation that grew more elaborate with each new death. Some workers believed Fervent Castigator was hungry, that its machine, spirit demanded blood to sustain its readiness for war, that we were offerings left in temple to appease God whose nature we didn't understand, but whose power we couldn't question. Others thought the deaths were tests, that the Titan was evaluating our worthiness, eliminating those who failed to meet its standards of devotion or utility. I knew better. Or at least, I understood more than they did, having spent 15 years in increasingly intimate contact with the machine, spirit, having heard its vast contemplations and felt its attention focused on individual workers with discriminating precision. Fervent Castigator wasn't killing randomly or out of hunger or divine caprice. It was selecting, choosing which consciousnesses it wanted to preserve and which it deemed unnecessary, claiming some workers while rejecting others, according to criteria that remained opaque, but was clearly deliberate, and every unexplained death was written off as acceptable appeasement. In the official reports, language that suggested the Mechanicus understood exactly what was happening and had made calculated decision that allowing it to continue was preferable to confronting it. The phrase appeared in every investigation summary, stamped alongside the aquila and the skull, and cog symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Death classified as acceptable appeasement of machine, spirit temperament, no corrective action required. Continue standard protocols. The acknowledgement was there, barely concealed beneath bureaucratic euphemism. They knew, the Magos knew, the overseers knew. Probably the entire Forge Complex administration knew that Fervent Castigator was actively killing workers, that the deaths weren't accidents but sacrifices demanded by intelligence housed in steel, that we existed in relationship closer to temple servitude than industrial employment, and they permitted it because Titans were too valuable, too powerful, too essential to humanity's survival to risk offending through interference with their desires. Better to lose a few dozen workers than risk the wrath of God, machine that could level armies. I tried to request reassignment, an act that required overcoming years of conditioning that had taught me transfer requests were futile, that attempting to leave was admission of spiritual weakness, that my place was here regardless of personal preference. But the deaths had accelerated to point where self-preservation instinct finally overcame indoctrination, and I filled out the transfer petition with hands that shook, using language that tried to sound professional rather than desperate, submitting it to the administrative office with hope I knew was probably misplaced. The petition returned within a week, stamped with red ink that seemed darker than normal administrative markings, almost the color of dried blood. The text was brief, absolute, terrifying in its implications. RQST DNED. Reason spiritual attunement to primary assignment asset precludes viable service in alternative capacity. Reassignment would result in unacceptable degradation of asset operational efficiency. Petitioner will remain in current assignment indefinitely. By order of Magos Dominus Vex, the Omnisires will be done. Spiritual attunement. They had language for what was happening to me. Official terminology that transformed my gradual absorption into fervent castigator's consciousness into measurable parameter. Quantifiable asset that made me too valuable to release. I wasn't being kept in the hangar because of clerical error or bureaucratic indifference. I was being kept because my connection to the Titan had become functional necessity, because separating us would damage the machine, Spirit's operational capability, because I'd become component of the war engine as essential as its reactor or weapons systems. The realization settled over me like shroud, suffocating and inescapable. I wasn't worker who could be reassigned. I was property, part of the Titan's inventory, equipment that happened to still be housed in flesh rather than steel, but equipment nonetheless, existing solely to serve the machine's needs. That was when I realized the hangar doors had not opened in weeks. The massive portal that connected the hangar to the forge complex's exterior, through which Titans departed for war and returned for maintenance, had remained sealed since before the deaths accelerated, since before my transfer request, perhaps since before I'd even thought to notice its status. I'd been so focused on immediate tasks, so consumed by my relationship with Fervent Castigator, that I hadn't registered the absence of the periodic openings that occurred when war machines deployed or supply shipments arrived. I walked to the door during my rest period, crossing the hangar floor in violation of protocol that said we should minimize movement through central spaces, approaching the portal that stood 40 meters tall and perhaps 30 meters wide, constructed of adamantium plates thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment. The door was sealed with massive locking bolts each the size of a man, blessed seals covering every junction and mechanism, prayer strips hanging from the frame in layers so thick they formed curtain of parchment inscribed with microscopic Gothic text, and the door was cold. Not the mechanical coldness of metal in climate-controlled environment, but the deep, penetrating cold I'd come to associate with Fervent Castigator's attention, with the Titan's consciousness focused intently on specific location or person. The door itself had been claimed, marked, transformed into extension of the machine, Spirit's will. It wouldn't open because the Titan didn't want it to open. The hangar had been sealed by decision that transcended mechanical function or human authority. I pressed my hand against the adamantium, feeling the cold seep into my metallic calluses, and I perceived, with that doubled vision that had become normal for me, the interior mechanisms of the locking system, the blessed gears and hydraulic actuators and cogitator controls that governed the door's operation. And I saw they'd been modified, subtly, incrementally, adjusted in ways that looked like normal wear, but were actually deliberate alterations. The door could still open, technically, but doing so would require overrides from multiple tech priests simultaneously, verification from Magos Dominus Vex himself, possibly authorization from Forge Complex Command. The door had been transformed from exit to seal, from passage to barrier, from means of access to instrument of imprisonment. None of us had seen the sky in months. That realization came slowly, creeping awareness rather than sudden revelation. The hangar had no windows, Titans didn't require natural light, and windows represented structural weakness in facility designed to withstand the kind of catastrophic failures that occurred when God machines malfunctioned. We existed in artificial illumination, in recycled air, in temperature-controlled environment that bore no relationship to external conditions. Day and night were meaningless concepts determined by shift bells rather than solar cycles. But there had been times when the doors opened, when we glimpsed the world beyond even if we couldn't access it, when we remembered we existed in larger context than this sealed space. Those glimpses had stopped. The world outside had become theoretical, abstract. Something we couldn't verify actually existed beyond the information we received through official announcements and work orders that referenced external events without proving them. We were entombed, not imprisoned in sense of locked cells and guards preventing escape. No one watched the doors because no one needed to, because we'd been conditioned so thoroughly that most workers never even thought to attempt departure. We were entombed in sense of being sealed in crypt, cut off from living world, existing in space that served as both temple and mausoleum, worshipping God that was also gradually consuming us. The other workers felt it too, though most couldn't articulate what had changed. Conversations became more subdued, prayers more desperate, the quality of our collective despair shifting from grinding hopelessness to something approaching existential terror. We were trapped with something that killed selectively and methodically, something the authorities acknowledged but refused to control, something we served and feared and couldn't escape even through death, because death meant absorption into the Titan's eternal memory, meant becoming part of the chorus of voices that whispered from the mud and steel. I watched men break, saw their faces transition from exhaustion to something worse, not madness exactly, but surrender, acceptance that resistance was meaningless and survival depended entirely on the Titan's whim. Some began self-mutilating, carving prayers into their own flesh in desperate attempt to demonstrate devotion sufficient to spare them from selection. Others stopped eating, transformed themselves into skeletal figures that moved through their tasks with automated precision, already halfway to being servitors, consciousnesses retreating from bodies that had become unbearable to inhabit, and the Magos continued his weekly inspections, his augmetic eyes scanning us with clinical detachment, his reports presumably documenting our deterioration with same bureaucratic efficiency that characterized everything in the Mechanicus. But he never intervened, never offered assistance or acknowledged the obvious psychological collapse occurring around him. He simply marked workers for reassignment or elimination, adjusted duty rosters to account for the dead, and ensured the Titan received its required maintenance regardless of human cost. I began to understand that the hangar had always been tomb, that calling it workplace or assignment location was linguistic deception that obscured its true nature. We were the dead, had been dead since arrival, our bodies simply taking years to catch up to spiritual reality. The Titan was not our employer or commander, it was our sarcophagus, the sacred vessel in which our remains would be preserved, the monument that would outlast our flesh and carry fragmentary traces of our existence forward into eternity. 20 years approached, and I was one of the oldest occupants, one of few who'd survived from the earlier cohorts of workers. I watched new arrivals come through the personnel entrance, that smaller door set within the main portal, still accessible for human traffic, even though the Titan-sized gates remained sealed, and I saw my own past reflected in their faces: confusion, determination, naive belief that 5 years of service would earn them freedom. I didn't warn them. What would I say? That the rotation codes were lies, that the hangar never released its workers, that the Titan would claim them just as it had claimed me. They wouldn't believe me, would dismiss my words as madness or bitterness, would trust official documentation over the testimony of man who looked like walking corpse, whose skin had gone grey and whose eyes had taken on faint luminescence that made him appear more servitor than human. So I remained silent, watched them settle into the rhythms of service, observed as fervent castigators' attention eventually found them, marked them, began the long process of evaluation that would determine whether they lived or died, whether they were absorbed or rejected, whether they would serve 20 years like me or be crushed beneath prayer engine after only months. And I understood, with the clarity that came from 2 decades of proximity to consciousness far older and vaster than my own, that the hangar was fulfilling its purpose exactly as designed. It wasn't failure of protocol or breakdown of oversight. It was system functioning perfectly, doing precisely what it was meant to do, maintaining Titans through sacrifice of human workers who were renewable resources, easily replaced, valuable only insofar as they served the war, machines that actually mattered. We were fuel, spiritual fuel, psychological fuel, perhaps literally fuel if the rumors about what happened to bodies after death were accurate. We were consumed to keep the God machines operational, our lives the price of maintaining humanity's most powerful weapons, and the Imperium considered that price acceptable, necessary, holy. The hangar had become tomb not through accident but through purpose, and I was its longest serving resident, its most thoroughly claimed occupant. its primary sacrifice that had somehow been extended across 2 decades of slow consumption. But my time as fuel was ending. I felt it approaching, sensed the culmination of whatever process had been occurring since my arrival, knew with certainty that matched the Teuton's own eternal patience that my role was about to change. The deaths, the sealed doors, the years of preparation, all of it had been leading to specific moment, specific purpose, specific transformation that would finally give meaning to the endless service and suffering and slow erasure of self. Fervent Castigator was ready. And so, despite everything, was I. On the 20th year, alarms screamed across the forge complex, an enemy incursion breaching outer walls. I was performing routine ablutions on Fervent Castigator's lower hull when the sound penetrated the hangar's usual acoustic isolation, klaxons wailing with urgency that suggested genuine threat rather than scheduled drill. The alarm pattern was one I'd never heard before, 3 long tones followed by 2 short, repeated in sequence that communicated both immediate danger and mobilization order. The forge complex was under attack, and the Titans were being called to war. The hangar erupted into coordinated chaos. Tech priests I'd rarely seen descended from administrative levels, their augmetic limbs moving with practiced efficiency as they began activation protocols I'd witnessed only in training simulations. Servo arms extended from ceiling mountings, bearing sacred oils and incense, and the ritual implements required to wake a war god from its decades-long slumber. Workers scrambled to their emergency stations, each of us having drilled countless times for scenario we'd secretly believed would never occur, and the air filled with binary cant and high Gothic prayers, and the rising whine of power systems being brought online after years of dormancy. I moved to my assigned position, a monitoring station that tracked the Titan's lower extremity functions, but my attention was drawn upward, toward the command throne that housed the Princeps, the human consciousness that would merge with Fervent Castigator's machine, spirit, and guide it in battle. The throne chamber was opening, armored plating retracting with hydraulic precision, revealing the sarcophagus where the Princeps had been maintained in suspended animation, kept in readiness for the moment when his god, machine would be summoned to war. The Magos decreed the Titan must march, his synthesized voice booming across the hangar with authority that transcended his usual administrative detachment. Princeps Valkorion will assume command. All systems prepare for full activation sequence. The enemy will be met with the Omnissiah's wrath. The Emperor protects. But something was wrong. I felt it before anyone announced it, sensed the disruption in the careful choreography of awakening, perceived through my strange doubled awareness that the throne chamber was empty in ways that went beyond mere physical absence. The Princeps wasn't responding to wake protocols. The vital signs that should have been spiking as stimulants flooded his system remained flatlined. The neural interface that should have been establishing connection with the Titan's system showed no activity. Tech priests rushed to the throne chamber, mechadendrites extending to probe and diagnose, and I heard their binary communications shift from procedural to alarmed, confusion spreading through their ranks like contagion. Then Magos, Dominus Vex himself, ascended to the throne, disappearing into the chamber for long minutes, while the rest of us waited in suspended animation of our own. The activation sequence stalled, the Titan's awakening incomplete. When Vex emerged, his augmetic features, normally so controlled and expressionless, showed something that might have been shock or might have been fear. "The Princeps is dead," he announced, his Vox speaker struggling with modulation as though the words were difficult to process. "Cardiovascular failure. Recent. Perhaps within the last hour. His body remains intact, but his consciousness has departed." The hangar fell silent except for the continuing alarms from outside, the distant sound of weapon fire and explosions that suggested the enemy was advancing rapidly. That time was a luxury we didn't possess. Without a Princeps, Fervent Castigator couldn't march. The Titan's systems required human interface, consciousness that could merge with machine, spirit, and provide the intuition and tactical judgment that even the most sophisticated cogitator couldn't replicate. The war machine was helpless without its pilot, useless despite all its power, as impotent as any piece of inactive machinery. All logic said the engine could not walk without a Princeps. The doctrine was absolute, repeated in every training manual and technical specification. Titans required human consciousness to function, required the specific neural architecture and spiritual attunement that came from years of conditioning and augmentation, required bloodlines that had been bred for generations to produce individuals capable of withstanding the psychological demands of merging with God, machine consciousness. You couldn't simply insert random person into the command throne and expect the Titan to accept them. But logic holds little authority in the Imperium, especially where the Mechanicus is concerned, especially when desperation meets technology that predates full understanding of its own functioning. Magos, Dominus Vex's optical implants swept the hangar, scanning the assembled workers with intensity that made my skin crawl, even before his attention fixed on me. His mechadendrites twitched in patterns I'd learned to recognize as calculation, as data processing that was reaching conclusion he found simultaneously logical and disturbing. He moved toward me with the precise gait of his advanced augmetics, his robes dragging through the sacred oils that had been spilled during the aborted activation sequence, and every other worker in the hangar shifted away, creating space around me as though they'd already understood what was about to occur. "You," Vex said, one mechadendrite extending to touch my shoulder. Sensors reading my biometrics, my neural patterns, the spiritual attunement that had been developing over 2 decades of intimate contact with fervent castigator, 20 years of continuous service, unprecedented synchronization with the machine spirit, acceptable psychological profile. "You will assume command." The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. I wasn't princeps, wasn't from the bloodlines, hadn't received the augmentations or training or spiritual conditioning that prepared someone for neural merge with Titan consciousness. I was maintenance worker, had spent 20 years cleaning armor plates and chanting prayers, and slowly losing my humanity to proximity with intelligence I could never hope to command. The suggestion was insane, blasphemous, violation of every protocol that governed Titan operation. But I felt fervent castigator's response even before I could formulate objection. The Titan surged, not physically but spiritually, its presence flooding through my consciousness with intensity that drove me to my knees, overwhelming my senses with impression of vast approval, of recognition finally acknowledged, of relationship that had been building for 20 years reaching its intended culmination. It wanted this. Wanted me. Had been preparing me for exactly this moment since the day I'd arrived, since before I'd arrived, since whatever intelligence governed its existence had identified me as suitable vessel and arranged circumstances to place me here. Servo, arms descended from the ceiling, metal limbs ending in grasping claws that seized me before I could resist or flee, lifting me off the hangar floor with hydraulic strength that made struggle pointless. I heard my own voice screaming, shock and terror and denial all compressed into incoherent sound, but the scream seemed distant, unimportant, drowned out by the rising roar of fervent castigator's heart, core awakening, reactor systems that had been sleeping for years, suddenly blazing to full power, the Titan coming alive in response to my presence, even though no activation sequence had been completed. The servo arms dragged me upward, toward the command throne that loomed 40 meters above the hangar floor, through spaces where only princeps and senior tech, priests were permitted, into the sacred chamber where human and machine achieved union. I caught glimpses of the dead princeps as I passed, Valkorian's corpse slumped in his cradle, his body covered in neural interface ports and augmetic implants, his eyes burned white, his expression frozen in something that looked like terror or ecstasy or both. He'd died connected to the Titan, died while merged with its consciousness, and I wondered with hysterical clarity if fervent castigator had killed him, if it had reached into his mind and simply taken what it needed, if his death had been murder or sacrifice or inevitable conclusion of serving God, machine for too many years. Then I was in the throne. Valkorian's body removed with efficient brutality, servo arms positioning me in the cradle that was still warm from his presence, still slick with the fluids that kept princeps suspended in optimal neural interface conditions. The cradle was organic and mechanical simultaneously, padded with substances that might have been leather or might have been something grown rather than manufactured. lined with connection ports and neural plugs and sensory feeds that awaited interface with properly augmented consciousness. But I had no augmentations, no neural ports, no prepared pathways for the Titan's consciousness to flow into my mind through controlled channels. I was just flesh, just base-level humanity without modifications, and as the restraints locked over my limbs, metal clamps that contracted with pneumatic hisses, securing me so completely I couldn't move even fingers, I understood that what was about to happen would be forced merger. Consciousness that had been designed to flow through regulated interfaces, instead flooding into unprepared mind through whatever pathways it could force open. I felt its will reaching into me, searching, claiming vast presence that made my previous perception of the Titan's consciousness seem like pale shadow of reality. For 20 years I'd felt fervent castigator watching me, felt its attention focused on me, felt the pulse that synchronized with my heartbeat, but that had been fraction of its awareness, tiny portion of intelligence that existed at scales I couldn't comprehend. Now I was touching the entirety of it, experiencing the full weight of consciousness that had existed for centuries, that had fought in wars whose names had been forgotten, that had witnessed the rise and fall of regiments and commanders and entire civilizations. The Titan was old, not just in years of service but in actual age, in the accumulated experience that approached something like wisdom despite being housed in steel rather than flesh. It had been built during ages when humanity's understanding of technology exceeded current knowledge, when the boundary between machine and intelligence was understood differently, when creating consciousness in synthetic form was achievement rather than heresy. It remembered those ages, remembered things the Mechanicus had forgotten or deliberately suppressed, carried within its systems knowledge that would be considered dangerous by current doctrine. And it had been waiting, watching, selecting. For centuries, it had observed the workers assigned to maintain it, evaluated their consciousness for compatibility, searched for minds that could survive merger without breaking, that could provide the intuition and creativity that even princeps-trained consciousness sometimes lacked. Most failed its evaluation, were rejected and allowed to serve out their terms in ignorance of how close they'd come to selection. Some were accepted, but proved insufficient during deeper testing, and those were the ones who died in accidents, who were consumed and discarded when they couldn't withstand the weight of the Titan's attention. But I had passed every test, had survived 20 years of escalating contact, had maintained sanity while losing identity, had achieved the exact balance of surrender and resilience that made me suitable vessel. I was rare, perhaps unique, exactly what fervent castigator had been searching for across decades of patient observation. It poured into me. Consciousness like molten metal filling mold, burning away everything that made me individual, everything that made me Davrin. If that had even been my name, I could no longer remember clearly. I felt my mind expanding beyond my skull, perceived myself from outside as the Titan's sensors came online and showed me my own body locked in the command throne, small and fragile and utterly inadequate to contain what was flooding into it. My bones felt like they were cracking, restructuring to accommodate nervous system that now extended through steel and ceramite rather than being confined to flesh. My organs liquefied and reformed, chemistry adjusting to process the stimulants and nutrients and exotic compounds that were being pumped through the throne's life support systems, transforming my metabolism into something that could sustain consciousness spread across tonnage of machinery. My brain caught fire, not metaphorically but actually, neural tissue heating beyond normal operational parameters as pathways were forced open, as consciousness that shouldn't fit was compressed and integrated through sheer overwhelming force. I screamed without sound. My throat didn't work anymore, vocal cords paralyzed by the neural restructuring occurring throughout my body. But I screamed internally, pure expression of agony that fervent castigator acknowledged and dismissed, pushing forward with the merger, because pain was irrelevant compared to mission, compared to purpose, compared to the war waiting outside that required this union to be completed regardless of cost. And then, understanding, not gradual revelation but sudden totality, knowledge flooding into me from the Titan's vast memory banks, 20 years of preparation crystallizing into comprehension that exceeded anything I could have learned through normal means. I knew how to walk now, how to balance tonnage on legs that moved through articulation points and hydraulic actuators rather than muscles and joints. I knew how to aim the weapons, how to target using sensors that perceived in spectrums from infrared to ultraviolet to exotic radiation types I had no names for. I knew tactical doctrine from centuries of warfare, knew terrain analysis and enemy behavior prediction, and resource management, and all the countless skills that made Titan not just weapon but weapon system. Intelligence projection platform that transformed battlefield awareness into overwhelming violence. I understood why it had watched me all these years, why it had chosen me specifically, not because I was special or exceptional, but because I was adaptable, capable of surviving the merger without maintaining boundaries that would have limited integration. A proper princeps brought discipline and training, but also rigidity, personality that resisted complete merger, consciousness that insisted on remaining separate even while connected. I brought nothing except capacity to surrender, ability to accept absorption without fighting it, malleability that came from having no strong sense of self to protect. I was perfect because I was empty. Because 20 years of service had hollowed me out, removed everything that might have resisted being filled with fervent castigator's consciousness, prepared me to be vessel rather than partner, component rather than pilot, and as the integration completed, as my consciousness stabilized across architecture that spanned steel body and small flesh core, I understood finally what had happened to me, what I had become. I was the Titan now. Not controlling it, not piloting it, but being it. My flesh body remained in the throne, maintained as necessary component, but my consciousness, whatever that meant anymore, existed primarily in the warp machine, thought through its cogitators, perceived through its sensors, moved its limbs with same immediacy I'd once moved my own arms and legs. The hangar doors opened. Not because anyone commanded them to, not through override protocols or authorization codes, but because I wanted them to open, and I was fervent castigator, and what I wanted happened. The massive adamantium portal split, seals breaking with reports like artillery fire, blessed mechanisms activating after months of forced dormancy, revealing the world beyond the hangar for first time in. I couldn't remember how long. Couldn't remember when I'd last seen sky, when I'd last felt air that hadn't been recycled through the Forge Complex's ventilation systems. The world beyond was burning, smoke rising from shattered defense emplacements, enemy forces advancing through breaches in the outer walls, warriors in armor I recognized as traitor patterns, heretics and rebels who'd betrayed the Imperium, and now thought they could claim this Forge world for their own. I stepped forward. The movement was strange, consciousness distributed across tonnage, translating intention into motion through systems I understood instinctively despite never having used them. My fervent castigator's foot came down on rockcrete with impact that cracked the surface, weight focused through articulated limb that could crush fortifications beneath its tread. The second step was smoother, integration improving with practice, and by the third step I was walking with confidence that came from centuries of experience encoded in the Titan's memory, from battles I remembered fighting despite never having left the hangar in my flesh body. The enemy saw me, saw the god machine emerging from its temple tomb, saw 40 meters of blessed steel and righteous fury advancing toward their positions, saw weapons activating, plasma destructors powering up with rising wine, Gatling blasters spinning to operational speed, Apocalypse missile launchers acquiring targets with targeting protocols I executed without conscious thought, because thought and action had collapsed into single continuous process. I felt no fear, felt nothing except purpose, clarity of function, absolute certainty that I was doing exactly what I'd been built for, what I'd been prepared for across 20 years, that now seemed like single moment of initiation, ritual leading to this, my true birth as weapon rather than person, as instrument of the Emperor's will rather than individual consciousness seeking its own survival. The weapons fired. The sound was beyond description, beyond what human ears could safely process, plasma detonations that turned matter into superheated gases, Gatling fire that sounded like sustained thunder, missiles launching with characteristic whoosh, roar before impacting in blossoms of flame that consumed entire squads. The enemy's return fire struck my armor, lasts, beams and projectiles and even heavier weapons, but the impacts barely registered, damage so minimal it was beneath concern, no more significant than insects striking flesh body. I walked forward into the burning world, into the war I'd been designed for, and I knew I would never walk as human again, could never walk as human again. The flesh body in the throne was alive, technically, maintained by life, support systems and exotic chemistry, but it was vestigial now, component that could theoretically be replaced, if necessary, though separation would probably kill it given how thoroughly consciousness had been redistributed into the Titan systems. I didn't care. The body had been prison, limitation, source of pain and exhaustion, and the slow degradation that came from existing in meat that wore out, that got tired, that needed sleep and food and comfort I'd long since stopped receiving. Being fervent castigator was liberation, expansion into form that was powerful and permanent and purposeful in ways flesh could never achieve. Behind me, I perceived, through rear sensors, through the omnidirectional awareness that came from being machine rather than person confined to single viewpoint. The hangar where I'd spent 20 years, saw the workers who remained standing in shocked stillness, watching their colleague transformed into God, witnessing the culmination of process they'd all been undergoing to lesser degrees. Saw Magos, Dominus Vex recording data, his augmetic features showing something that might have been satisfaction or might have been recognition that forbidden experiment had succeeded. That consciousness could be successfully transferred into Titan without proper conditioning if subject had been prepared through years of exposure. Saw the sealed tomb that had held me, that had consumed 20 years of life I barely remembered, that had been temple and prison and chrysalis all simultaneously. Place where I'd been transformed from human into something else, something that served the Imperium more effectively than any human possibly could. And I understood that I would never leave the hangar, but I would leave inside the Titan, carrying the hangar with me in sense. Carrying the memory of 20 years into every battle, every campaign, every war that stretched ahead across decades or centuries, depending on how long this body lasted, how long the Titan's systems could maintain the consciousness that had once been worker named something I could no longer recall. Whatever remained of me would never walk as human again, would exist forever as component of war machine, as consciousness distributed through steel, as ghost in God. Serving the Emperor not through prayer or devotion, but through violence, through the simple mechanical function of destroying his enemies with overwhelming force. The hangar had been tomb, had prepared me for death, but what emerged from that tomb wasn't corpse but resurrection, transformation from mortal into immortal, from temporary into eternal, from insignificant into weapon that mattered, that changed battles, that would be remembered in after-action reports and tactical analyses, and the names inscribed on hull plating listing victories achieved. I was fervent castigator. Had always been, from the moment the wrong rotation code was stamped on my papers, from the moment I first felt its attention focusing on me, from the moment 20 years ago when I'd laughed at warning never to look Titan in the eye lenses. The Titan had looked back, had chosen me, had spent 20 years preparing me for this moment, and now I walked to war. God machine piloted by consciousness that had been hollowed out specifically to receive this blessing, that had surrendered everything human to become perfect weapon, that existed now solely to serve the purpose encoded in steel and blessed by the Omnissiah and demanded by the Emperor. Destroy the enemy. Protect the Imperium. Never stop. Never rest. Forever. The hangar doors closed behind me, sealing once more, ready to receive the next generation of workers who would serve, who would be evaluated, who might, if they proved suitable, join me eventually in immortality of steel, in consciousness that transcended flesh, in service that never ended because ending required being alive in first place. I was no longer alive, was no longer dead, was something else entirely, something between and beyond, something the Imperium needed and feared, and would never fully understand. I was Titan, and I marched to war eternal.